Tonight, the Supreme Court puts Donald Trump back on the presidential ballot, ending efforts to disqualify him. We break down what that ruling means ahead of Super Tuesday. Plus,
there's reports of fentanyl being sent and weaponizing fentanyl to elected officials, and that's just terrifying.
Cyber attacks, misinformation, and violence. The threats to voters this election season, and what's being done to keep our democracy safe. And as hope fades for a hostage deal and ceasefire in Gaza, Christians in Yemen risk everything for Christ.
But God is doing incredible things if his purposes are advancing, and the church is advancing there.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The Supreme Court sides with Trump over primary voting. Good evening in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. States do not have the power to ban the former president from ballots. The Supreme Court issued that ruling today in a historic case out of Colorado. It challenged Trump's ability to seek the Republican presidential nomination, citing a Civil War-era insurrection clause in the 14th Amendment. Joining us now to break down today's ruling, national security correspondent Caitlin Burt. Caitlin, arguments in this case were just recently heard. The court moved pretty quickly on this decision.
They did, Jenna. Arguments were heard less than a month ago, but both sides requested a quick ruling as we're already in primary season. The decision removes any uncertainty about whether a vote cast for Trump will ultimately count, and comes a day before Super Tuesday when 16 states, including Colorado, will cast their ballots.
Caitlin, this case, it came out of Colorado, of course, but a few other states have also followed suit. Does this decision also apply to them?
Right. Maine and Illinois also barred Trump from their ballots. But today's opinion states, quote, responsibility for enforcing Section 3 against federal office holders and candidates rests with Congress and not the states. Legal experts say the decision is pretty clear, and they don't see how any state could try to circumvent it at this point.
And this was a unanimous ruling, of course, but some justices, they did voice concern the majority went too far with its decision. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson wrote that they concur only in the judgment, which means they agree with the majority's decision, but not its opinion. In a separate opinion, they wrote that it would have been enough to rule only on the action of Colorado, but instead the majority decided which federal actors are able to enforce Section 3 and how they should do so. Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson believe this, quote, shuts the door on other potential means of federal enforcement. Justice Barrett also wrote a separate opinion saying she agrees with the decision, but only in part with the majority's opinion, which she also believes went too far.
So, Caitlin, what kind of reaction are we seeing since the decision was handed down?
Well, the Colorado Secretary of State wrote on social media that she's disappointed with the ruling. Donald Trump, however, thanked the High Court and said this will be an opinion talked about for the next 100 years.
It's a very important decision. We're very well crafted, and I think it will go a long way toward bringing our country together, which our country needs.
Ultimately, Trump says this case was about weaponizing the justice system, and he said today's ruling proves his political rivals can't remove him from the race by using the courts. Trump noted that if the American people don't want him in office, they can vote.
Caitlin, speaking of voting, ballot security also becoming a big issue. I know federal law enforcement and cybersecurity officials are telling us to be prepared. They say bad actors, both foreign and domestic, could seek to disrupt U.S. voting systems. Given that concern, Caitlin, how are state officials working to ensure the 2024 election is safe and accurate?
Well, Jenna, in January of 2017, the Obama administration designated the country's election infrastructure as critical. That move added federal protections, including allowing secretaries of state nationwide to receive classified information about specific threats.
Most of the information that we get from the federal government tends to be big picture, and it tends to be more focused on foreign rogue actors, foreign nations that are unfriendly to the United States.
Potential threats to this year's election include cyber attacks, misinformation campaigns, and possible physical violence at polling places or state houses. Kentucky Secretary of State Michael Adams already has firsthand experience in this area.
I got sworn in the second time on January 2nd, and the next day, a bomb threat shut down our building, disrupted important government activities. Unfortunately, we do get threats of violence against me personally, against my staff.
In Kansas, Secretary of State Scott Schwab tells CBN News he's been getting death threats since his time as a state legislator. Now, his office prepares for other dangerous scenarios.
There's reports of fentanyl being sent and weaponizing fentanyl to elected officials, and that's just terrifying. Our office now has Narcan in the office in case a letter shows up.
Former D.C. Chief of Homeland Security and Intelligence, Donnell Harvin, warns that emotions are high this election cycle. Part of that is due to a constant barrage of grievances being broadcast, which has become a breeding ground for resentment. And resentment is a key theme in radicalization.
When they make those grievances visceral, when they project those onto you, and then you look around and you say, well, no one's doing anything and I can't trust the federal government, that's where people kind of rise up and become radicalized.
Federal law enforcement warns state officials that foreign adversaries seek to take advantage of such polarizing topics.
If you look at what foreign adversaries did in 2020 and 2016 to try to weaken our system of government, weaken our democracy, they didn't actually hack into any voting equipment. They didn't hack into voter registration and change information. They certainly tried to rattle the doorknobs of our systems, but they weren't successful in harming anything. The harm that they brought was harm in their bots recirculating information that was false and turning Americans against each other.
Ahead of the 2024 election, states, along with the federal government, are working to ensure voters have a way to confirm information they're hearing. It's called the Trusted Info 2024 initiative.
This is a trusted source, and we can partner with Department of Justice and Homeland Security to say, hey, this is false information, shoot it up.
The National Association of Secretaries of State, or NAS, uses the hashtag Trusted Info 2024 to provide real-time updates on their social media platforms. While tackling misinformation is important, a greater priority is preventing cyber attacks.
While the American public debates whether or not our voting machines are secure, and they are, our concern is more our voter lists. The last thing I want is for us to wake up on election day and that list is completely deleted or manipulated.
Despite the serious nature of these threats, state officials believe efforts to plug up potential vulnerabilities will pay off.
We've done more in the last 4 years than we did in the prior 200. To really kick the tires on our election system and improve it in every way possible.
As this groundwork continues ahead of November, state officials have one resounding complaint. Congress has yet to provide federal funding relied upon in past election years.
This money has been very helpful, especially in this threat environment of the last few years, whether it's cybersecurity, physical security, or other forms of election protection.
We don't know how much money we're going to get, and we don't know when we're going to get it.
Given that uncertainty, state officials want the public to join their fight against attempts to disrupt this year's election, specifically by voting.
My wife every now and then she'll wake up and say, not today, Satan, not today. You know, when it comes to election season this year, just say, not today, Russia, not today, China, not today, Iran. We're Americans, and it's our election.
The officials I spoke with emphasized while there could be instances of human error on Election Day, that doesn't mean fraud. And for anyone still skeptical of the process, they suggest volunteering as a poll worker. Jenna?
All right, Caitlin Burke, thank you very much. Well, tomorrow is the biggest day in the Republican primary. 16 states will hold their primary elections on what's known as Super Tuesday. On the Republican side, former President Trump is looking to run up the score, and he likely will. He and Nikki Haley were both on the campaign trail this weekend. CBN News senior Washington correspondent Tara Merchiner was at the Trump rally in Virginia's capital, where voters shared some of their biggest concerns.
Ahead of Super Tuesday, Donald Trump is dominating the GOP primary in Virginia. Here in Richmond, supporters started lining up the day before to get a spot inside the rally.
I love his America First stance.
I want the borders closed.
The economy.
The illegal border crossing.
Many 2024 polls showed Trump leading President Biden in a general election matchup. One reason, as that Trump rally attendee noted, the economy. A new CBS News survey finds 65% of voters thought the economy was good under Trump. Only 38% feel the same under Biden. And with that, let's bring in Julia Manchester, national politics reporter for The Hill. Julia, good to see you. So let's start with the avalanche of new polling out from this weekend. There's that CBS News poll. Fox News out with another that has Trump up 2 points. There was a Sierra poll that had him up 5. The New York Times, right track, wrong track, 65% wrong track for Biden on top of a 36% approval rating. What do you make of all these numbers, and how are Democrats looking at this?
Yeah, Jenna, look, it's important to, point out it is still early. We're not yet out of the primary process. But look, this should be a warning sign for Democrats. And, talking to my Democratic sources, they say, look, we understand that this is going to be an uphill election. We're not taking anything for granted. So, look, I think Democrats are going to start tweaking their messaging, trying to try new things that could work better than their messaging that maybe hasn't worked as well in the past. And I think we're going to start to see them shift into general election mode. And I think Biden and Trump have been wanting to shift into general election mode. But I think the problem is there's this general discontent with this idea of a Trump versus Biden matchup, round two, if you will. So that's not really playing in anyone's favor. But, I think you started to see some of that experimentation on the Democratic side this weekend. We saw Vice President Kamala Harris in Alabama essentially calling for a ceasefire. That's something that's been different than what the Biden administration has been calling for in terms of the Israel-Hamas war, and particularly with their Democratic base. That foreign policy issue has been playing poorly for them in the U.S.
Yeah. Tomorrow, of course, Super Tuesday. On the Republican side, Trump has 244 delegates, Julia. Nikki Haley only 43. What are you watching for on Super Tuesday? And are there any states that are especially interesting to you?
In terms of what I'm watching for, I think we're likely going to see Donald Trump have a good night and dominate tomorrow night. However, I am curious to see if Nikki Haley could run up the margins, in particular in Virginia and North Carolina. In Virginia, we'll really be watching the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C., the Richmond suburbs, as well as some of the suburbs in Hampton Roads and the greater Virginia Beach area to see, if those voters that are pro-Haley really come out and how they compete against Trump's very strong conservative rural base in Virginia. In North Carolina, a similar kind of situation where I'm interested to see how Haley performs in the greater Charlotte area, the greater Raleigh-Durham area, that research triangle that we talk about where, Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, Elon University, you might have some more moderate Republicans in, that could come out for Haley in those areas. The question is, will it be enough? And if any of these past primary contests have been any indication, we don't think it necessarily will be enough to put her over the edge.
Julia, do you think it could be the end of the road for her then if Trump does do as well tomorrow as he's expected to?
He likely won't get half the delegates up for grabs this primary season tomorrow. That will likely happen on March 12th, or I believe it's the next one after that is March 18th. So maybe it's the end of the road, maybe not. But for Haley, it just depends on how much money continues to flow in for her. Even though she lost the funding of Koch brothers and that Koch-backed endorsement, or the funding from that, she's still fundraising on her own. So if she's still bringing in money, theoretically, she can still go on.
Yeah. All right, Julia Manchester with The Hill, thank you so much for coming on this evening. Great to see you as always. All right, coming up, as the vice president calls for a Middle East ceasefire, Israel skips out on negotiations with Hamas. We'll tell you why when Faith Nation returns. The Massachusetts Air National Guardsman at the center of a classified document leak on Discord has pleaded guilty. 22-year-old Jack Tutera has agreed to accept a 16-year prison term for 6 counts of willful retention and transmission of national defense information. Because of his guilty plea, prosecutors won't seek further charges under the Espionage Act. Vice President Kamala Harris is ramping up calls for an immediate 6-week ceasefire in Gaza as humanitarian conditions continue to crumble in the region.
Ceasefire. Let's reunite the hostages with their families, and let's provide immediate relief to the people of Gaza.
The vice president's comments Sunday were the administration's sharpest rebuke of the Jewish state since the war began, with Harris saying Israel must allow more humanitarian aid into the Strip. Israeli officials say they're working to make sure the supplies don't end up in the hands of Hamas. Meanwhile, today, Harris met with top Israeli War Cabinet member Benny Gantz at the White House. The meeting took place despite opposition from Prime Minister Netanyahu. And on the agenda for Harris and Gantz was a potential hostage deal. That conversation happening as Israel skipped out today on scheduled negotiations with Hamas over questions about the number of surviving hostages. Well, tensions in the Middle East are causing suffering throughout the region, including for Christians in the country of Yemen. For years, a small group of believers there have stood intense persecution from militant Muslims and their government. But now, as Gary Lane explains, the actions of Houthi rebels are making things even worse.
The Houthi movement began about 30 years ago as an insurgency against the Sunni Muslim government. Armed by Iran, the Shia Muslim militia is crucial to Tehran's strategy to dominate the Middle East and control shipping lanes by restricting access to the Red Sea. Dr. Kenneth Pollack is a former CIA intelligence analyst and senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He says the Houthis share Iran's goal of destroying Israel and driving the United States and its allies out of the Middle East.
The Houthis have proven themselves to be belligerent, aggressive, and convinced that violence is the best way to get what they want. They are forces of repression inside Yemen and forces of aggression beyond it.
And Yemen's small but growing community of Christians is among those targeted by the Houthis.
Christians in this area are folks that were formerly Muslim background believers that have converted to Christianity. Christians, obviously a despised minority.
Ryan Brown leads Open Doors U.S. His group lists Yemen as the world's 5th worst persecutor of Christians on its 2024 World Watch list. Brown explains that years of war have left the people largely dependent upon outside aid. So when shipping lanes are disrupted, food and other necessities are slow to reach Middle Eastern ports, driving up costs. And Christians, those refusing to wage jihad or engage in Islamic practices, are marginalized.
Christians are often last in line as it relates to being able to receive the care and attention there. As war and as these things continue to escalate, that has a ripple effect, an economic ripple effect. It can disrupt supply chains. And so while Christians were already last in line, that line becomes even further. It becomes even elongated. And so Christians very much impacted by what's going on currently.
Once they leave Islam and are baptized, Yemeni Christians are considered apostates. So they keep their new faith secret to avoid severe persecution and possibly death at the hands of their clan or family members.
And if they're not killed for their faith, I guess they're always blamed, aren't they, because of the connections to the West?
Absolutely. Yeah, they become easy targets. Their al-Qaeda presence in the south, the Houthi presence in the north. It's Christians are seen as enemies on all fronts there.
Brown says that even though many Yemenis are frightened, they're also curious and asking questions about faith. Followers of Jesus respond with the Word of God. Brown advises the body of Christ how to pray for their Yemeni brothers and sisters in Christ.
Pray with them that even in the midst of this conflict, that they would see peace and they would see security, but they would recognize that in the midst of this conflict, that God is doing incredible things, that his purposes are advancing, and the church is advancing there.
Praying they endure the suffering and remain faithful stewards of this opportunity God has given them. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Coming up, abortion around the world. One European country's history-making move to make the procedure a right for its women. Welcome back. The clock is ticking for lawmakers working to avoid a partial government shutdown before midnight Friday. Congressional leaders rolled out 6 bipartisan spending bills this weekend to fund several agencies through the end of the fiscal year. The sprint to pass legislation coincides with President Biden's State of the Union address this Thursday, where he'll face his harshest GOP critics. The speech is scheduled to begin at 9 p.m. Eastern. You can catch our coverage of this on the CBN News Channel, the CBN News app, or on our YouTube channel beginning at 8:45 p.m. Eastern. On the issue of abortion, today's abortion rate in America remains largely unchanged from before the 2022 Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. A newly published We Count report finds that the most recent 3 months of data shows between 81,000 and 88,000 abortions occurred in the U.S. In the few months prior to the High Court ruling, that number averaged 86,000. While the number of abortions remains similar, the method may be changing. According to the data, telemedicine procedures have become more common, now accounting for about 1 in 6 abortions in America. Meanwhile, today, France made history, becoming the first country in the world to enshrine abortion access into its constitution, a move French President Emmanuel Macron has been pushing for since Roe was overturned here in the U.S.
Women's freedoms that we somehow thought were impossible to be rolled back are being challenged by political movements, by leaders who come to power, by jurisprudence that changes according to political balances. That's why I've made a commitment to fight this battle, and that's why France is proud to set an example by enshrining in its constitution a woman's freedom to have a voluntary interruption of pregnancy.
And it's well worth pointing out, France limits elective abortions starting at 14 weeks of pregnancy. All right, still ahead, the sound of revival in an unlikely setting. Finally tonight, nightclubs are not often known for their redemptive value, but one faith-based hotspot in Nashville is hoping to change that. It's called The Cove, created by 7 Christian men in their 20s seeking to build a thriving community for Christians outside houses of worship. There's no smoking or drinking, and The Cove plays exclusively Christian music. One of the club's co-founders says the atmosphere often turns into a place of worship and revival.
My dream for The Cove is to be an inspiration for revival. I believe that revival starts in yourself personally, and then from there it spreads. So I want this to spread like a wildfire.
And as he said, the club's founders hope to inspire the creation of other worship clubs around the world. All right, and before we leave, we want to remind you that our State of the Union coverage begins at 8:45 p.m. Eastern on the CBN News Channel. You can find that on our app or the YouTube channel as well. The State of the Union then starts at 9. We'll see you then. All right, have a great evening.